Sekal had been alive for 900 years. He had watched empires rise, signed treaties, and collapse into footnotes. He had catalogued wars, border disputes, famines, and the quiet extinction of 3 species who simply stopped having children 1 century and never started again. He had seen things that made younger archivists weep. He was not the kind of being who frightened easily. So when the annexation claim landed on his desk, a thin data file from the Vethkara Empire, stamped with their cold, 6-sided seal, he did not feel dread. He felt something closer to mild inconvenience. The Vethkara were expanding again. They did this the way some species breathed, regularly, without apology, without much thought. He opened the file, read it once, and made a note in his archive. Target species, human. Colony designation, Callan's Rest. Population, 40,000. Resource value, agricultural, mid-tier. Strategic value, transit corridor access, minor. Vethkara justification, unclaimed outer rim territory, insufficient military presence, no formal defense treaty with Conclave Corps members. Sekal set down his stylus. He had catalogued 12 previous Vethkara annexations. All 12 had gone the same way. The target species protested, filed counterclaims, requested arbitration panels, sat through 4 or 5 sessions of careful, polite discussion, then, eventually, quietly accepted something lesser than what they had lost, because accepting something lesser than nothing was still better than nothing. He assumed the humans would do the same. He had met humans before, over his 9 centuries. He liked them, in a distant, an academic sort of way, the way one might like a curious insect. They were warm-blooded, short-lived, and very fond of talking. They had been members of the Galactic Conclave for 300 years and had spent most of that time building trade relationships and mediating other people's arguments. They were good at it. Several species kept human diplomats on permanent retainer specifically because humans had a talent for finding the sentence that made both sides feel they had won. They were not, by any measurable standard, dangerous. He wrote that in his archive, too, before he had any reason to question it. Dana Fitch arrived at the conclave chambers on a Tuesday morning, moving through the great circular hall with the ease of someone who had memorized every social custom of every species in the room. She wore a dark jacket and carried nothing in her hands, which was a deliberate choice. Bare hands were a sign of openness in 6 different alien languages, and Dana Fitch never walked into a room without calculating what her body was saying before her mouth opened. She was the head of Unified Human Affairs. She was 44 years old. She had spent 20 of those years in these chambers, and she knew every corridor, every delegate, every quiet alliance and older grudge hiding behind formal courtesy. She also knew what was waiting for her on the session floor. Counselor Vren, one of the elder Orathi, fell into step beside her as she entered. Vren was old in a way that made Sekal look young. Her species measured time in geological shifts, and she moved like something that had outlasted several versions of the galaxy. She leaned close to Dana without breaking stride. "You have seen the filing," Vren said. It was not a question. "This morning," Dana said. "And?" Dana's jaw tightened. "One small movement, gone in a second. And I will file the counterclaim. Request the panel. Do what we always do." Vren was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was very low. "Yes," she said. "Do that." Something about the way she said it made Dana slow her step slightly, but Vren had already moved away, and the session was beginning, and there was no time. Dana filed the counterclaim that afternoon. She submitted the arbitration request by evening. She had it done cleanly, correctly, by the book. And she flagged the Vethkara timeline as aggressive and formally requested they hold their fleet outside Callan's Rest's transit corridor pending the panel's first session. The Vethkara representative accepted the request with a small, polite inclination of his upper body. Sekal, watching from the gallery, wrote in his notes, "Routine. Expected. Will likely resolve within 4 sessions." He went home to his archive. He made tea. He began cataloging a separate matter, a minor territorial dispute between 2 species on the far eastern rim, and did not think about Callan's Rest again until his communication screen lit up at 0600 the next morning. The alert was not from the Conclave. It was from one of the elder species monitoring stations, an automated flag triggered by weapons discharge in the outer rim. Sekal stared at the coordinates for a long moment. Then he pulled up Callan's Rest. The Vethkara fleet had not waited for the panel. It had dropped out of transit above the colony at 0300 local time, in the deep hours when the colony's 40,000 people were asleep. Standard absorption protocol, the same sequence they had used 12 times before. There had been no warning broadcast, no evacuation window. The protocol was designed for efficiency, not cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Sekal read the full incident report very slowly. The action had taken 11 minutes. He sat with that number for a long time. 11 minutes. A species with 40,000 people, 40,000 lives. People who had gone to sleep the night before in houses they owned with children in the next room, with food on the counter for morning. And 11 minutes was all it had taken to make that a past tense thing. He opened a new file in his archive, began composing notifications to the elder species, as was protocol for significant incidents. He had barely written 3 lines when the first response came back. Not from one elder species, from all of them nearly simultaneously, which was unusual enough to stop him mid-sentence. The Orathi, the Velkan Collective, the Deep Space Sen, species who had not agreed on anything in 400 years, responding within minutes of each other. They were not asking for details. They were not expressing outrage or requesting action. They were asking one question: how did the Vethkara not know? Sekal stared at his screen. He did not understand the question. He did not understand why they were asking it with what read, even through formal diplomatic language, as something disturbingly close to fear. He wrote back asking for clarification. None of them answered. On the conclave floor, Dana Fitch's chair was empty. The entire human delegation's chairs were empty. They had not filed a protest. They had not issued a statement. They had simply not come in, which was more unsettling than anything they could have said. The Vethkara representative sat at his place at the session table and looked at the empty chairs across the hall and felt, for the first time in a long career, a sensation his species had no precise word for. It was in the vicinity of unease, but colder. Sekal finished his notification file and closed it. He looked at the elder species' responses one more time, still sitting unanswered on his screen. Then he looked at the incident report. Then he looked at the number again. 11 minutes. He picked up his stylus. He wrote one final note before he closed the day's archive. I have begun notifying the elder species. They have already heard. I do not understand why they are afraid. He set down the stylus, looked at the wall of his office for a long moment. Outside, the conclave hummed on. Delegates moved through corridors. Sessions were called to order. Business, as it always did, continued. The human chairs stayed empty. Hira Len filed her first dispatch from the conclave observation deck on a Wednesday morning. Her species, the Urayi, had maintained strict neutrality for 600 years, and which meant they had a front-row seat to almost every significant event in the galaxy and an institutional policy of not caring about any of them. Hira Len was good at not caring. She had trained for it. She wrote, Incident at Callan's Rest, Human Colony, Outer Rim, 40,000 casualties, Vethkara annexation, executed outside arbitration process. Human diplomatic delegation has withdrawn from conclave floor. No statement issued. Monitoring. She sent the dispatch. Made tea. Sat down to watch. What she watched for the next 72 hours was the human broadcast networks. She had access to them through the conclave's media relay, and she pulled them up expecting the usual pattern. She had seen this before with other species, the outrage cycle, the political speeches, the calls for military action, the flags and the slogans and the particular noise that grief made when it was being performed for cameras. The human networks were not doing any of that. Every channel, every feed, across every human-accessible broadcast platform in the conclave system was playing the same thing. A voice, calm and unhurried, reading names, one after another. 40,000 names, in alphabetical order, without commentary, without music, without any interruption at all. They had been doing it for 72 hours without stopping. Hiralen watched for a long time. She pulled up the broadcast counter. The list was not even halfway through. She filed a second dispatch. They are not protesting. They are not making demands. They are reading names. All of them. They have been doing this for 3 days. I do not have a category for this behavior. Continuing to monitor. On Earth, in a building that faced a gray October sky, Admiral Cal Merritt received his orders. The orders were written on physical paper, which was either very old-fashioned or very deliberate, and with Cal Merritt it was always hard to tell the difference. He read the paper once. He folded it into thirds with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years folding things correctly the first time. He put it in his breast pocket and walked to the window and looked at the sky for 30 seconds. Then he went to find his fleet. In the loading bay of the carrier ship Antietam, Colonel Nora Voss was doing inventory. She had been doing inventory for 6 hours, which was not strictly necessary. Her team had already done it twice. But Nora did a third pass when things were serious. Because she had learned early in her career that careless people counted things once and careful people counted them until the number stopped changing. She had a marker in one hand and a tablet in the other, and she was running projected yields in her head while her mouth kept talking to her team about logistics. Corporal Eli Dre was 19 feet away, loading crates. He was 22 years old and from a small town in Ohio where the biggest thing that had ever happened was a grain elevator fire in 2019. He had been in the fleet for 14 months. He was not sure, on a cellular level, what was happening, but he could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Something large was shifting in a direction he couldn't quite name yet. He watched Nora make a sound. It was short, and like one syllable of a laugh that decided halfway through it wasn't funny. "What?" he said. Nora looked up. "Nothing." That wasn't a nothing sound. "I was doing math," she said, and went back to her tablet. Eli went back to his crates. He did not ask again. He was young, not stupid. At the emergency conclave session, the Vethkara representative gave a formal address explaining the annexation. He used calm, measured language. He cited the original filing. He noted that the arbitration request had been submitted, but that Callan's Rest had technically lacked sufficient conclave defense treaty coverage to compel a hold order. Legally, he argued, the action existed in a gray area. The chamber was quieter than usual for a conclave session. Sekel, in the gallery, noticed which seats were empty. Not just the human delegation. 3 elder species had pulled their senior representatives and sent junior proxies instead. He had never seen that before. You sent junior proxies to sessions that were not important. You pulled your senior people away from sessions when you needed them somewhere else. He wrote a note, find out where the senior Orathi representatives went. He never got an answer to that one either. Ambassador Hiralen tried, as a formality, to reach the Human Diplomatic Office to request a comment for her neutrality dispatch. The channel was open. Someone picked up. There was silence on the line for 4 full seconds. Then a human voice said, "We don't have a comment." The line stayed open. Hiralen waited. "We're a little busy," the voice said. Then the line closed. She filed this in her dispatch verbatim because she didn't know what else to do with it. Dana Fitch walked into the conclave chamber on Thursday afternoon, alone. No aides, no delegation, no documentation team. She walked the long aisle from the entrance to the session table, and the sound her shoes made on the floor was the only sound in the room because people had stopped talking when she came in, the way they stop talking when something enters the space that changes the air. She put a single document on the table. She did not speak. She turned and walked back out. The document was processed by 3 different translation teams before the Conclave legal office would confirm what it was. It was not a counterclaim. It was not a request. It was a formal filing under Article 1 of the Conclave Charter, an article so old most current diplomats had never had cause to read it, an article that predated the Conclave's current structure entirely. The article allowed a member species, under specific conditions, to temporarily withdraw from all Conclave dispute resolution mechanisms and operate under a separate status. The translation of the filed status into Vethkara took considerable time because the Vethkara language did not have a clean equivalent for the concept. The closest the translation team could produce was, "We are no longer speaking." Zurath, the Vethkara fleet commander, received the translation and read it twice. He ran his probability models again. The models were not giving him what he needed. He ran them a 3rd time. Outside the Antietam, in a hangar bay on the edge of human-controlled space, Eli Dre sat on a crate and called his mother. He told her he was fine. He told her he didn't know exactly when he'd be home. He told her not to worry, which was something he had said to her so many times across so many deployments that it had become a kind of ritual, not a promise, just a thing said between them to hold the space where the promise should be. His mother asked if he'd eaten. He said yes. She said good. He said goodbye. He sat there for a moment after the call ended, looking at the hangar floor. Then he got up and went back to loading crates, because the crates were not going to load themselves, and there was math that needed doing. And Nora Voss was already back at her tablet, and the sound she made when she looked at the numbers was the same short, not-quite laugh as before. Sekel closed out his session notes that night and looked at the day's archive. He had more questions in it than answers. He had things flagged for follow-up that kept returning empty. He had a growing collection of elder species communications that said, in various ways, nothing useful. He looked at Dana Fitch's document one more time. Read Article 1 again. He understood the legal mechanics of it. He did not understand what came next. He wrote, "The human chairs are still empty, not in protest, not in anger. They filed their document and left. I have asked 3 colleagues what they think this means. 2 did not answer. 1 told me to look at the pre-conclave archive if I wanted to understand. I asked which section. She said I would know when I found it." He closed the file. The name-reading broadcast was still going. Somewhere on every human network feed running through the conclave relay, a calm voice was still working its way through the list. It was on the letter G. Sekel found the archive on a Sunday morning. He had been looking for 3 days. His colleague had told him he would know the section when he found it, and she had been right. Because when he opened the sealed record, a level of clearance he had held for 2 centuries and never once needed to use, the first file was labeled with a date so old it predated the conclave's current calendar system. He had to convert it twice. The date came back to roughly 4,000 years ago, and the file was titled Assessment. First contact with subject species, origin system Sol, 3rd planet. He opened it. The being who had written it was long dead, from a species that was itself now long dead, and the writing style was formal and careful in the way that beings wrote when they were trying to appear calm about something that was not calm at all. Sekel had read enough historical documents to recognize the particular distance that crept into scientific language when the scientist was frightened. The assessment described a species in conflict with itself. It described their weapons, their strategies, the rate at which they adapted those strategies when the first approach stopped working. It described something the author called escalation pattern, non-linear, which meant that when pushed, This species did not simply push back with equivalent force. They pushed back with more, and then more again. And then, when they ran out of more, they invented new kinds of more. The numbers were very large. The casualties were their own. Both sides in the conflict being described were human. Sekal sat with that for a long time. He opened the next file. Different species, different era, same subject, then a third, then a fourth. 7 assessments in total from 7 different observers across 4,000 years, none of whom had any knowledge of the other reports. All of them had reached the same conclusion in their own languages, in their own scientific frameworks. The conclusion, translated into conclave standard, read something like, "Do not interfere. Do not provoke. Do not assume that what you see at rest is what exists in motion." Sekal leaned back in his chair. He looked at his ceiling. He thought about the humans he had known. Dana Fitch with her careful hands and her fluency in 17 alien social languages. The trade representatives who remembered birthdays, the mediators who had a talent for finding the sentence that ended arguments. He thought about how they had described themselves to him over 3 centuries of membership as a species that had grown past its worst history. He thought about the numbers in the files. Then he thought about Callan's rest. 40,000 people. 11 minutes. He opened a new document and started writing. Not a formal archive entry. Something longer. Something he was not sure he had the framework for yet, but he needed the motion of writing to think. Aboard the Antietam, Lieutenant Commander Owen Marsh was going over targeting parameters when he stopped. He had been working through the tactical package for 2 hours, cross-referencing it against everything he knew about Vethkara fleet formation doctrine, because that was his job, and he was good at his job. The parameters he had been handed were not what he expected. They did not match the Vethkara's own published tactical models, which the Vethkara had submitted to the Conclave as part of a transparency agreement 3 decades ago. Every species did this. It was considered polite. The parameters Cal Merritt's office had sent down did not engage the fleet at all. Owen looked at the logic chain. He followed it from the first coordinate to the last. He understood it in about 30 seconds. He sat very still for a moment. "Zao," he said, to the empty room. He went back to work. In a briefing room below decks, Nora Voss stood at a white surface with a marker and talked her unit through what they were going to do. She was not dramatic. She used short sentences and drew plain diagrams and answered questions when they had them and let silence sit when they didn't. Her unit was 11 people, and all 11 of them were watching her the way people watch when they need the person at the front of the room to be the realest thing in it. She diagrammed the node network. She explained how it worked, how the Vethkara collective intelligence synchronized through it, how it ran their tactical processing during combat, how without the nodes the fleet fought blind and slow and separate. A soldier named Lou asked how many nodes there were in their sector. "Oh, 5, Nora said. "And we're hitting how many?" "3. Lou did the math. "Who gets the other 2? "Different teams," Nora said. Silence. "So all 5 go at the same time," Lou said. "Around the same time," Nora said. She recapped her marker. Someone in the back asked if what they were planning was still legal under the Conclave Charter. Nora set the marker down on the tray. She looked at the person who had asked, not unkindly. "Dana withdrew us from the charter 8 days ago," she said. "We refile when this is done." The room was quiet again. Eli Dre, who was sitting against the back wall, looked at his hands. The Conclave emergency session on Friday was the loudest Sekal could remember in recent decades. Several species were demanding action. Several others were demanding restraint. The Vethkara representative gave a second formal address, more clipped than the first, defending the Callan's rest action and citing historical precedent for Outer Rim annexation. He pointed out that humanity had filed for conclave withdrawal rather than working through the process, which he argued suggested instability rather than strength. Sekal, watching from the gallery, noticed that the elder species representatives were not participating in the argument at all. They were not shouting. They were not filing counter motions. They were sitting in their seats, quiet and still, the way old things get quiet when they have seen the shape of what is coming and know that arguing with it is not useful. 3 species, he noticed, had begun moving non-essential personnel out of sectors near the Vethkara border. And he flagged this in his notes. He tried to understand the logic of it. If the conflict was between humanity and the Vethkara, the border sectors to evacuate would be human-adjacent, not Vethkara-adjacent. Unless someone expected the Vethkara border to become a much more active place very soon. He went back to his archive. He kept writing. Zurath, the Vethkara fleet commander, ran his probability models a 4th time. His collective analysts had produced 17 scenarios, and he had reviewed all 17. In 15 of them, humanity protested, applied conclave pressure, and eventually accepted a negotiated settlement. In one of them, humanity mounted a small defensive action in the Callan's rest sector, incurred acceptable losses, and returned to the negotiating table. In the 17th scenario, listed at the very end and flagged as statistically negligible, something else happened. The model could not fully define the 17th scenario because the model did not have sufficient historical data to construct it. The model's note on that gap said, in the dry language of probability systems, insufficient precedent. Subject species has not engaged in interspecies conflict at this scale. Extrapolation unreliable. Zurath's analysts had flagged this as a minor data limitation. Zurath, sitting now in the quiet of his command chamber with all 17 scenarios in front of him, looked at that flag for a long time. He decided to demonstrate strength. A second fleet movement, a larger colony this time closer to the conclave core, a show of consistency. Yes, it would signal that the first action was not a mistake or an overreach, but a policy. It would force humanity to respond through channels. It would end the silence, which was the part he liked least about the current situation. The silence was not in any of his models. Models required data, and the silence was producing none. He gave the order. Sekal closed his archive late that night, having written more in one day than he had written in the previous decade. He looked at what he had produced. It was not complete. It would not be complete for some time, but the shape of it was becoming clear to him in the way that terrible things sometimes became clear. Not all at once, but incrementally, each piece making the next piece make more sense than you wanted it to. He wrote one last line for the night. I understand now why no one told them. The question was never whether they could. The question was whether they would choose to. The Vethkara have provided an answer to that question. I am not sure they understand yet what they have answered. He set down his stylus. Somewhere across the galaxy, in the deep quiet of outer rim space, Cal Merritt's fleet was already waiting. It had been waiting for 6 days. Eli Dre's job was to carry things. He carried ammunition, mostly. Sometimes he carried the wounded. Sometimes he carried equipment through corridors that had partially collapsed, squeezing through gaps that a larger person could not have managed, which was why Nora had put him on her team in the first place. He was not the strongest or the fastest or the most experienced person in the unit. He was the one who fit through the small spaces and kept moving. He thought about this a lot in the hours after things started. The engagement began at 0400. He knew this because his watch said 400, and the sound started exactly then. Not an explosion, which was what he had been expecting, but something lower and more continuous, like the building itself was changing its mind about being a building. He was in a corridor on the 3rd sublevel of the first Vethkara ground node, following 2 people he trusted more than himself, carrying a crate that weighed roughly 40 kilograms, and the light kept shifting in a way that made his eyes work harder than they should. He did not think about the large shape of what was happening. He thought about the crate. He thought about the floor under his boots. And he thought about the person in front of him and whether they were still moving. They were still moving. He kept going. Hira-Len filed her dispatches from the Conclave observation post as quickly as she could pull information together, which was not very quickly because the information was arriving in fragments. This was itself unusual. The Conclave information relay was very good. It almost never fragmented. The fact that it was doing so now told her that a very large number of things were happening in a very large number of places at the same time. She pieced together what she could. The human fleet had not attacked the Veth-Kara fleet. This was the first thing that surprised her. Every model she had access to, every strategic projection, and every probability assessment the Conclave's analysis office had produced had assumed the engagement would be fleet on fleet. Standard combat doctrine, ships against ships. Cal Merritt's fleet had engaged the nodes, not the Veth-Kara ships, not the Veth-Kara command structure. The network that connected the command structure, the relay system, the synchronization points, the infrastructure that allowed a collective intelligence to function as one thing instead of many separate things. Without the nodes, a Veth-Kara fleet did not stop existing. It just stopped thinking together. She filed this in her dispatch and then sat quietly for a moment. A species that had studied the Veth-Kara for any serious length of time would have known about the nodes. A species that had not studied the Veth-Kara at all would have gone for the ships. The fact that humanity had gone for the nodes meant they had studied the Veth-Kara very carefully, very quietly, and at some point had decided to keep that study to themselves. She did not know when that study had begun. She suspected it had been going on for longer than anyone would have guessed. She wrote, "The humans are not fighting the way the Veth-Kara fight. They are fighting the way they used to." Then she looked at that sentence for a moment, unsure exactly what she meant by it, but certain it was true. Nora's unit hit the first node at 0412, which was 8 minutes behind schedule, which Nora took personally in the way she took all logistical failures personally, not with drama, but with a particular quiet that her team had learned to read as the storm before the storm. The node was defended, not heavily, and because Veth-Kara ground doctrine did not prioritize static defense, they preferred mobile response, fast and coordinated, which worked very well when their coordination system was intact. When it was not intact, mobile response became 9 individuals all deciding independently what to do next, which was considerably less effective. Nora talked to herself in the second person when things went wrong. Her team had noticed this early and learned to treat it as useful information rather than worrying about it. "You are going to move left now," she said, moving left, as a section of wall became briefly unreliable. "You are going to put the thing in the place, and then you are going to not be standing there when the thing does what the thing does." Lou, who was behind her, had learned to simply follow these instructions as if they were directed at him, which mostly worked. The node went down at 0441, 29 minutes for the first one. Nora recalculated the timeline for the remaining 2 in her head, adjusted, and sent the update to Owen Marsh without comment. Owen Marsh received her update, and 3 others within the same 6-minute window. He plotted the pattern. It was working. The sequence was designed so that each node that fell created a gap in the Veth-Kara's collective processing, and each gap made the next gap easier to create, because a thinking system that was trying to compensate for a missing piece was a thinking system with less capacity left over for anything else. He passed the pattern to Cal Merritt's command. Cal read it, folded nothing, said nothing, and moved to the next thing. And Zurath received the first node loss alert at 0448. He ran his models. The models gave him a response sequence. He issued the sequence. The response ships moved. They moved correctly, according to their individual training. The problem was that individual training and collective coordination were not the same thing, and the gap between them, which had never mattered before in 12 annexations, mattered enormously now. His ships were doing what they knew to do. They were not doing it together. By the time the second node fell, 0519, Outer Rim Sector, simultaneous with two other losses that Zurath had not yet been informed of, the pattern was visible even in his fragmented data stream. He ran the models again. The 17th scenario, the one his analysts had flagged as statistically negligible due to insufficient precedent, was no longer statistically negligible. He did something he had not done in his career. He sat very still and felt something moving through his processing that was not tactical calculation. It was cold and individual, and had no useful output. His own analysts, who shared cognitive space with him, registered it with a kind of collective alarm. A Vethkara commander was not supposed to feel this way. A commander was supposed to be a node in the system. A node did not feel individually afraid. He was feeling individually afraid. This was, in its own way, a form of defeat before the defeat was complete. Eli Dre came out of the third node facility at 0603, carrying one end of a stretcher. On the stretcher was a member of his unit named Carla, who had a broken leg and a deep cut above her eye that was being dramatic about bleeding. Eli and a soldier named Pete carried her across open ground to the extraction point, and the ground was uneven, and the light was still doing the thing with the colors, and Eli focused on his boots and the weight of the stretcher and making sure his grip was good. Carla told him she was fine. He said he knew. She said it really wasn't that bad. He said okay. She said she'd had worse. He said sure. She said stop humoring her. He said he wasn't, and smiled. And she laughed despite herself. And they made it to the extraction point at 0611, and Eli set the stretcher down and stood up straight and looked at the sky. It was a strange color, not terrible, just strange the way skies were on worlds that were not yours. By midday, the engagement was functionally over. 6 of the 9 nodes across all sectors were down. 2 of the remaining 3 were isolated and operationally useless. The Vethkara fleet was intact in terms of ships, but operating as separate units with no coherent strategy, and a fleet of separately operating ships with no coherent strategy was very much like a brain with most of its connections cut. Alive, technically, but not doing anything useful with that aliveness. Cal Merritt's fleet had not lost a single ship. Hyra Len stared at that number in her data for a long time. Then she filed her dispatch, which was the longest one she had ever written, and at the end of it she added one personal note that she debated removing before deciding to leave it. I have been filing neutrality reports for 40 years. I have never added a personal observation to a dispatch before. I am adding one now, and I do not think the Vethkara understood what they were starting. I am not certain anyone outside the elder species did. I am including this note because I want the record to reflect that what happened here was not inevitable. It was chosen, both the provocation and the response. She sent it. At 1400, the communication from Zurath arrived. It was brief. It was in formal conclave standard. It was addressed directly to Admiral Cal Merritt, bypassing the conclave diplomatic infrastructure entirely, which was itself a statement. It requested terms. Cal Merritt's response was ready in 4 seconds. He had written it 6 days ago. Sekal, who received a copy as a matter of protocol, read the terms 3 times. They were fair. They were specific. They were, given the state of the Vethkara fleet, are far more generous than the math required them to be. He wrote, I have been trying for 3 days to determine whether the restraint should comfort me. I am still trying. The armistice was signed on a Thursday. Nobody threw a party. There was no celebration broadcast, no speech from a podium, no moment that was photographed and circulated as the image of the thing. The human networks, which had been reading names for 3 weeks straight and had finally quietly finished the list, went back to ordinary programming. weather reports, local elections, a story about a dog that had learned to open its own food cabinet and was being very proud of this. Eli Dre watched the dog story on his bunk, on his tablet, on the ship still parked in the sector where the third node used to be. He laughed, which surprised him. But he hadn't laughed in a while. It felt a little strange in his chest, like a door that had been shut long enough to get stiff on its hinges. 2 days later, he was discharged. He took a transport to a connector hub, then a commercial shuttle to Earth, then a train from the Chicago terminal to a town in Ohio that had not changed at all while he was gone, which he found deeply, unreasonably relieving. His mother was on the platform. She was wearing the blue coat she wore when she thought something was worth wearing the good coat for. She hugged him for a long time. He let her. She asked if he was hungry. He said yes. She said good. He stepped off the platform, and the ordinary ground of home came up to meet his boots, and that was that. Sekel spent 4 weeks writing, and he had not written anything of this length since his earliest years as an archivist, when everything had been new and the impulse to document it all had not yet been worn smooth by the weight of centuries. He wrote the way he had then, not quickly, but with focus, stopping often to sit and think before the next paragraph, letting the shape of the argument build slowly. He was not writing a history. He was writing a warning. He was writing it for the being who would someday open the sealed archive and find it the same way he had found the 7 assessments, late at night, with tea going cold beside them, with a slowly growing dread that was not about the numbers, but about what the numbers meant. He wanted that being to have something he had not had. He wanted them to arrive at the understanding faster, and with less confusion, and less time spent asking questions that the elder species would not answer. He titled the document, Notes on a Species That Chose to Remember What It Buried. He wrote about Dana Fitch's bare hands and what they were saying before her mouth opened. He wrote about the 40,000 names, read in alphabetical order for 3 weeks, and what that silence said that shouting could not. He wrote about Owen Marsh understanding a targeting parameter in 30 seconds and saying only "oh" before going back to work. He wrote about Nora Voss making a sound that was not quite a laugh when she ran the numbers, and about what that sound meant when you understood who she was and what she was looking at. He wrote about Cal Merritt's terms. He returned to those for a long time, circling them in his prose the way you circle something you cannot fully explain but cannot leave alone. The terms were fair. They were restrained. They were, by every calculation, less than humanity could have demanded. A species that had just demonstrated, cleanly, efficiently, without losing a single ship, that it could dismantle the Vethkara's operational capacity inside of 12 hours, could have demanded a great deal. It had not. The restraint was the message. Sekel understood this eventually after 3 weeks of writing. The restraint said, "We know exactly what we are capable of. We are choosing this instead. The choice is the point. Remember that we made it, because the alternative was available and we set it aside." He sealed the document, placed it in the archive, added it to the sealed record, just below the 7 assessments that had waited 4,000 years to be found. Then he sent a copy to Hiralen because he thought she had earned one. She read it in a single sitting, which took most of a night. She sent him back a 1-line response. "I will file this in the neutrality record and note that I was here." He appreciated that more than he told her. The Vethkara ratification session was held on a Monday. Zurath appeared via projection, full size, at the conclave floor. His first formal appearance since the engagement. He was composed. He was correct. He signed the terms in the formal sequence, spoke the required acknowledgement phrases in conclave standard, and completed the protocol without visible difficulty. Cal Merritt sat in the public gallery, 3rd row, hands folded. He had been asked, as a courtesy, to be present. He was not at the table. He had nothing to sign. His function in the room was simply to be a visible, still thing, an anchor point for the other species who wanted to see him and confirm he was not, in this moment, a threat. He sat there and let them confirm it. Zurath did not look at him during the signing, not once in the full 30-minute session. Cal did not look away. Dana Fitch stood at the session floor afterward and gave a short address. She had written it herself at 3 in the morning, in the same kind of economy she used for everything. Nothing wasted, nothing explained that could be implied. She thanked the conclave for the process. She announced that humanity was formally refiling its charter membership, effective immediately. She noted that the charter had been amended under her name and with a clarification to Article 7, the article that governed interspecies engagement. She read the clarification aloud. It was 2 sentences. The first said, "A species at peace is not a species without memory." The second said, "Do not mistake the first for the absence of the second." She did not say anything else. She gathered her documents, walked back to the human delegation's chairs, full again, all of them, every human diplomat back in place, and sat down. The session continued. Hyra Len filed her final dispatch from the conclave deck that evening. She wrote it plainly, as she always did, but she let it run longer than her usual reports. She described the session. She described Zurath not looking at Cal Merritt. She described Dana Fitch's 2 sentences and what the room did when they were read, the particular quality of silence that falls when something lands correctly, when the language does exactly the thing it was meant to do. At the end, she wrote, "I have spent 40 years filing neutrality reports. I have tried to be a recorder, not a judge. I am closing this file with one judgment, on the record, because I think the record requires it. The Vethkara did not make an error of aggression. They made an error of ignorance. They looked at a species that chose peace and concluded that peace was all the species knew. The oldest rule in the galaxy exists, because this error is always available and always expensive. Today it was demonstrated again. I expect it will need to be demonstrated again, someday, to someone else. I hope the cost is lower next time. I do not expect that it will be." She sent the dispatch, turned off her screen, sat in the dark for a moment. Then she went home. Sekel closed his archive at midnight. He had one last entry to write, a brief one, a closing note, the kind of small administrative line that would sit at the bottom of the file and be the last thing anyone read before they moved to the next document. He held his stylus for a moment. He thought about the 7 assessments and the 4,000 years they had waited in the dark. He thought about the species that had written them, careful beings, honest beings, beings who had seen something and written it down as accurately as they could because they understood that the record was the only thing that outlasted the moment. He thought about Dana Fitch's 2 sentences. When he wrote, "The rule has always existed. It simply needed every few thousand years to be demonstrated again. I have filed this under things that should not require demonstration. I do not expect it to stay there." He set down the stylus, looked at the wall, listened to the quiet of the archive around him, all those centuries of records, stacked in the dark, patient and permanent. Then he turned off the light and went to sleep.